So thanks again to everyone for coming out and being interested in attending Bridging the Space Between the Lab and the Press. This is the first workshop from Austin, Texas Science Writers, and we're very excited to have so many people here. My name is Julie Girsham, and I'm Vice President of the group. For those of you who don't know or haven't heard about us, we were formed officially in December 2017 as a nonprofit, and we started this group because we wanted to bring together science writers and scientists who are interested in communicating with the public. I personally have lived in Austin for 8 years, and I did not meet another science writer here until we started this group. So it's been really great for all of us. Writers tend to be introverts, and it's hard for us to get out and meet people. So I think this is a really good way for us to do that. I've lived in several other cities that have had active science writing groups, and when I moved here, I couldn't believe that Austin didn't have one. And so I'm really excited that now we do. But one thing that we're trying to do that's different from some of the other science writing groups is we really want scientists to be more involved. This is not just a group for writers, it's a group for people who are active in the research community, who are interested in developing their own writing skills or working with writers to really get the word out about what they do. So this workshop was funded by a grant, a Peggy Girsham idea grant from the National Association of Science Writers, and we want to thank them for their support. This is the first of 3 workshops. The second one will be December 1st, and we're hoping we can announce the speakers for that one soon. The third one is going to be in February. Dates still to be decided on that. And as part of getting funding from NASW, we are required to report back to them about what we did here and what was accomplished. And so that's why we're filming and recording, and that's why we've given you these questionnaires. So I hope everybody had a chance to fill out their questionnaire and turn it in, and there's going to be another questionnaire at the end of the day. Also, NASW is having their annual meeting in Washington, D.C. next month, and Liz and I are going to be attending that meeting, and there's a special pre-meeting for heads of regional science writing groups. So we're going to be getting together with people from Boston and Washington and Sacramento and San Diego and talking about what different science writing groups are doing around the country and hopefully bringing back some great ideas. But we already have a lot of events going on here. We've been having happy hours. We've been having co-writing meetups at various coffee shops and places around the city. We'd be very excited to have more people getting involved and helping us planning those or suggesting locations of good places to just hang out and write when you're not sitting in your room by yourself. And we hope that everybody here will go to our website and become a member if they haven't already, and sign up for our newsletter so that you'll find out what we're doing. We have a Science and Nature book club that's going to be starting up. We have our first meeting October 7th, and that is in collaboration with Book People. We're going to be meeting in the Book People Cafe, and our first book is the classic Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, and there's more information about that on our website. Everybody should have the program, but I wanted to tell you a little bit more about what we're going to be doing today. We're going to have our panel first, and then the rest of the day is going to be pretty much all interactive activities. There's lots of food, there's lots of drinks, and happy hour at the end. I want to thank Gas Pedal for letting us use this space and also for providing our non-alcoholic beverages. And want to thank ABGB for providing the beer that we're going to have for our happy hour, and especially thank our volunteers who came out early this morning and helped us set up and get ready. The bathrooms, if you didn't find them, are right over there. And again, if you haven't already filled out your survey, please do that. And now I'm going to bring up Stevana, our group historian, who's going to introduce our panelists.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to ATX SciRise inaugural workshop today. So today we're going to start the workshop off with a really interesting panel featuring some prestigious individuals in the field of science communication. To my left, we have Dr. Susan Hovorka, who's a senior research scientist at the University of Texas at Austin. She's investigating the problem of climate change and how to mitigate climate change through carbon capture and storage. And she's talked to media outlets like PBS and has been interviewed countless times. So she's going to bring you the perspective of what can you as a journalist say and do better when communicating with scientists. We have Dr. Julie Burwald in the middle. She's a science writer and science journalist. She's written for outlets such as National Geographic magazine, Discover magazine, Wired.com, The Huffington Post, Slate, and several other popular science outlets. She's also recently published a book called Spineless, The Science of Jellyfish and the Art of Growing a Backbone. And here on our left is Mark Earhart, our moderator. He has 15 years of experience as a science communicator, and he is currently the communications coordinator and a science writer at the College of Natural Sciences at the University of Texas at Austin. So let's give our panelists a round of applause.
Well, thank you. Glad you're all here on a rainy day. I guess you could be out canoeing. No, probably not. Maybe we're going to just expand a little bit on our introductions just so you know a little bit more about us before we dive into the discussion. So I'm Mark. I'm a Virgo. I like long walks on the beach. I like pina coladas. Just kidding. As Stefana mentioned, I am the communications coordinator in the College of Natural Sciences at UT. And what that means is really kind of two different kinds of roles. So one looks very much like journalism. I'm interviewing scientists, I'm writing about what they do, I'm producing podcasts, I'm communicating with audiences directly through a magazine and a website and all sorts of other platforms that you would recognize from any other sort of media outlet, but I'm doing it for a university. So that's one piece where, because of new media, because we have the ability to contact people through social media and through podcasts and all these other outlets, we have the ability to directly reach our audiences. So that looks very much like journalism. The other half of what I do is a little different, and I know at least one other person in the audience does something similar, but it may be different for a lot of you, and that's basically the media relations piece of being a public information officer, and that looks a little different. It's developing relationships with science communicators, it's developing relationships with the scientists themselves, and kind of being a broker between those two camps. So I have a somewhat unique perspective in that I do something very journalistic, but I also do something very, what you might consider more like public relations. So I think that's why I'm here, to kind of be a little bit of a glue between two different kinds of worlds. So anyway, so that's a little bit about myself. Before that, just I do have proper journalistic background too. Before that, I worked for a radio program called Earth and Sky, which was a daily science radio program, and I was a writer and producer for that for many years. And so that's where I sort of cut my teeth on the basics of talking to scientists, getting the story on their research, and then figuring out how to explain that to a non-technical audience. So I think that's what a lot of us aspire to do or are already doing. And so anyway, so that's the other piece of my background. But enough about me. I'd like you to get to know better our two panelists. So I think I'll pass it off to Julie to talk a little bit about her experiences and what she does.
I'm a Virgo. My favorite color is blue, and
nice.
So I actually started off as a scientist. I got my PhD in ocean science, working also on climate change question, which was how much carbon dioxide does the ocean take up? And this was a long time ago, so we didn't know. Now we know it's about 30% of the carbon dioxide that we emit. And then I had a postdoc, which I brought here, and I was really bad at basic science, I found out. So I got off that path and I started writing textbooks. And I did that for a few years, and I got laid off while I was on maternity leave. And so but then I started freelancing. And I started freelancing for mostly educational media. And I will say this, that writing for textbooks because I don't have formal training as a journalist or as a writer, really, writing for textbooks was incredible training because I learned how to really write science with the fewest words possible, because textbooks don't give you very much space to explain a huge amount of scientific information. So that was kind of how I became a writer. And then I had written a chapter on, they gave me a lot of physics to write. So I wrote like this chapter on waves for the 6th time, because waves do what waves do. And I was kind of bored of it. And so I started, I tried pitching articles to more mainstream magazines. And National Geographic picked up a couple for their front of the magazine, which was an amazing thing. I got very lucky. It was a physics article about how water bugs get out of the water. Yeah. So it was, so anyway, so I did that for a while, and I found that I really loved writing science for the public. But I also had to keep my freelance jobs, and so I worked with Sue for many years, and we'll talk about that. I still work for her, actually, and communicating what she does for their website. But along the way, in 2011, I finally got this idea that I wanted to write a book, and so I wrote this book about jellyfish. And part of what I wanted to do in that book was to talk about jellyfish and how they're changing globally and what they're telling us about what we're doing to the oceans, but also talk about my personal life and scientists and how we do science and how we communicate science and what it means to talk about science to the public and why it's so important. So that's where I come from. So I kind of had I've had a very circuitous path, but that's kind of how I got to be here.
Okay. I'm Sue Havorka. I'm a research scientist at University of Texas at Austin. I have no journalistic skills, and I know several science writers. Stevana, Julie, Mark, and Emily. I hope after today I'll know more of you. I would like tutoring on how to get the science that we're doing out to you guys, because you guys are the voice, the way to communicate to all kinds of stakeholders. And science communication is difficult and really important. I may say a lot of mean things, but I love my science writers. I really think what you do is critically important. I'm here. I came out early so I wouldn't get flooded in, because I think this is really important. So if I say mean things, I have some frustrations. I will like to share them with you, and maybe you'll tell me how to handle it better and how to get science findings out. I myself am a geologist. I like any fluid flow through any kind of rocks from the rock perspective, and I've done all kinds of things. I've looked at groundwater resources, groundwater contamination, producing oil, and the thing that kidnapped me from my nice job at working in the politics of the Edwards Aquifer, the hydrology of the Edwards Aquifer and the politics descending therefrom was working on climate change mitigation. Through the process we call carbon capture and storage, CCS. How many of you have ever heard of this? Good, well done. Not enough people have, and that's one of my sources of frustration, is because we tend to split information into this and this. So one kind of information is let's get rid of fossil fuel forever, and the other kind of information is burn baby burn. And this is the middle of the road. I brought a piece of fossil fuel, just so everybody could think about fossil fuel. This is a regular a wax candle made from, okay, so we do not actually, on a rainy, cold day, think about the virtues of very high intensity, easily accessible, portable fuel. Getting rid of fossil fuel is well, we're not going to discuss it here, but it's maybe not, it's like the diet you're going to start tomorrow. Getting rid of fossil fuels, kind of like that. It's climate change mitigation is too important to say we're just going to get rid of it. So we need this middle of the road where we can abate, manage the greenhouse gases. So that's what I do. We actually do the monitoring to show that when you capture, compress, inject the CO2 deep in the earth, well below usable resources, it stays isolated. We do the monitoring, design the monitoring. So if you have questions, things that no one has thought about, it becomes a research problem for us to find out how we provide the assurance that what is said is true, that this is going to be permanently stored by research. Did I say everything I needed to say? I think so.
I think that's a good start.
I got very bad grades in English, so you guys will have to help me with the paragraphs, topic, sentences. All
Fair enough. Well, one thing I'd like to start with is talking about trust. One big issue is that a lot of the public doesn't trust journalists. A lot of the public doesn't trust scientists. And at the same time, scientists and journalists themselves, between each other, sometimes don't have the level of trust that they need to communicate effectively. So let's talk about trust for a minute. So just to start off, I did a little background reading, and the Pew Research Center did a study last year where they asked people how much trust they have in different groups of people around different issues. So, for example, they asked people, who do you trust to tell you the truth about vaccines? And the good news is that they trust scientists more than a lot of other groups, say industry groups or politicians or things like that. Bad news is they don't trust scientists that much. So, for example, on vaccines, 55% of the public say they trust medical scientists a lot to tell them the truth about vaccines. The news media, only 8% of people trust the news media to tell you the truth about vaccines. It gets worse. Climate change, Sue's specialty. The general public trusts climate scientists. 39% of them say they trust climate scientists a lot to tell them the truth. News media, only 7% trust them. So you can go down the list of various topics, and these, granted, these are the more controversial topics. When you get on more general things like, do you trust scientists to make a nice iPhone for you? Well, then, yeah, we trust them to understand electronics and things like that. Genetically modified foods, 35% of the public say they trust scientists a lot. Only 9% trust the news media to tell them the truth. So I'm kind of curious, Sue, from your perspective, why you think the public, even scientists, like these are people who are experts in climate or genetically modified foods, why does the public still have such skepticism about scientists?
I think the issue is the definition of truth, that people expect an actionable answer. They think a scientist has facts, and that all you have to do is ask a scientist what the fact is about any of that list, and you'll get a fact. And that's not actually what scientists do. They don't actually provide facts. So it makes the relationship with the public difficult. Scientists know how to find things out. And we actually like questions more than we like answers, and the public likes answers more and has very little tolerance for questions. So that makes the relationship difficult and the trust low, because people say, well, I don't know whether you wanted me to eat salt or not eat salt. I don't know whether you wanted me to do, you didn't give me one answer. And scientists are, by our discipline, by our rules, are forbidden to provide one answer. In fact, we hate journalists when you take the statement we make that said, considering this under the methods of such and such with the distribution of an uncertainty of this, such and such. And you just pull out the such and such, publish that, and say, well, that's not true. That's not true. It's only true when you put all that other stuff in front of it. I don't know what we're supposed to do. I would love it if people would understand if you could communicate a little bit more of what scientists do. They can attack problems, they can reduce problems, they can provide you actionable information, but they can't actually generate true facts.
Just to stick with Sue for a second. So, I mean, do you have any thoughts on how scientists can build that trust better?
Well, I think we need you, the textbook writers, the media, to help. Scientists are trustworthy. We have, for the most part, we have rules. We follow them, and we have processes that enforce those rules. But most people don't understand our rules, so then they think that we're slithering, not telling. We're avoiding answering. Did climate change cause that hurricane? Well, that is not an answerable question, because causality, truth, fact is something that we can say. Causality is very difficult. So I'll start maundering on about causality, and everyone will be upset. Why can't you tell the truth? So it's more about a matter of people. I don't know I don't know what the answer is, but I think the communication, some of it lies in better communication.
Yeah, maybe we'll work on that in this workshop. Maybe that's why we're having this workshop. I'm curious, Julie, if you have thoughts from the sort of the communicator side, why there's so little trust, especially for, as I read, some of those single digits, people trusting the news media to tell them the truth on these issues. Do you have thoughts on why that might be?
Yeah, I think that's very scary, actually. I mean, a little bit is the amount of space that we have as writers to convey very complex topics. So, if you're given 500 or 750 words, you as a writer cannot put in all of the information that Sue wishes you could. And so it's your job to somehow distill that, and you may end up, I don't know, you may end up in a place where that's the struggle, right? To convey the science accurately with a few words, and words that will keep your reader reading until the end of the article. So it's a hard job. I think science journalism is a hard job, and you may spend, for those 750 words, you may interview 8 people, and then you have 8 times more information than Sue has, and your editor is telling you this is it, this is how much space you have. So it's a fundamentally hard job, and I guess that hard job sometimes translates into a reader being like, I don't get it, or I don't know. I don't know how you lose trust in that dissemination process, but it can happen. Also, I feel like we're really assaulted by so much media these days that the public is. I know I am. I feel like it's a fire hose. And science gets lost in that fire hose. So it's up to us to somehow try to tell stories in a way that rise to the top, It's a hard job. I'm not sure I have answers to it.
I think Julie just said an important thing, which is tell a story, which is one of the things you did really well in your book. It's about facts about jellyfish, but it's also about finding out about jellyfish. Half of the story is how you find out. And I think a lot of times everyone is trained that science is about facts, but it's really about finding out. So if you pitched your story about how do you find out, and I've seen a number of people do this well. It's not that there is no journalism, but that a lot of people will, a lot of stories will repeat the same facts because it had to be condensed, 500 words. And I'm in sympathy. I can't write 500 words to tell a story coherently. I understand. But if some of the pitch was, how do you even find out? Maybe more trust would come. You would pull back and show what's happening. These scientists are working on this problem, and this is the methods they're using to attack. And they think they might be able to understand the importance of hurricanes through this method. And that if it was a little more of a story about how science gets done rather than a fact-driven report.
I have one more thing to say. This may or may not be interesting. I've taken some some creative writing classes to try to understand how narrative can be worked into science writing. And one of the things one of the writers in my science writing class said, and this creative writing class said, was every story has to have pain in it. And my jaw kind of dropped to the floor because I'm like, really? I don't understand that. And I think the reason why is because I think every science story has wonder in it. It doesn't have pain in it. Or may have pain in the case of a hurricane. No, it may, or in the case of climate change. But I think the root of a science story is wonder. And so we have that. I think that that's our advantage, is that we can find the wonder, and that can keep your reader reading. So it is about discovery.
I thought you were going to do scientists' pain.
Well, scientists have a lot of pain.
Scientists tried this, it didn't work. They tried that, it didn't work. They're going to try this. They hope for the best.
So I don't know. That may or may not be useful, but if you're looking for a hook, you can look for pain or you can look for wonder. But those are two places to look for. But those are two places to look for story within science. So I don't know. Okay.
Yeah, I think those are great points. So good storytelling can take you a long way. Yeah, the advice I often come back to on storytelling is, to be effective, you need to have some stakes involved. And that can be painful, right? It can be, scientist X, the story's interesting because maybe they had a really complicated experiment and their expensive piece of equipment just fell off the ship, the side of their ship, and they lost it. And so there's this whole drama around, how they're going to continue their project without this, multi-million-dollar piece of equipment. But this, you're right. I mean, wonder can be enough to carry a story as well. It doesn't always have to be some pain. So we've talked a little bit about building trust from the outside, but how about between scientists and science communicators? I think we all agree that the public needs to understand science better. They need to trust the scientists better. They need to understand it better to make informed decisions. So we're all in this together. How do we develop a good working relationship between these? We kind of need each other, right? Scientists and science communicators. So I'm just kind of curious. Maybe this can be kind of like a couples therapy session. So I was going to ask Julie if you could talk about some of the things that you need from scientists, or things that maybe they don't appreciate about being a science journalist, that if they understood that, you could do a better job and you could both together communicate better to the public.
Yeah, I think maybe Sue should start this one.
I have 100 complaints about journalists, and I've also been treated very, very well by a bunch of people who did great stories for us, and but let me talk about the pain. There are a couple of things. I have on my wall some instructions for in case a journalist calls and they say, you can only get 1 or 2 points across, 1 or 2. And then it says, the journalist is not your friend. That's what it says on my wall. Because any journalist who smells blood in the water will eat you. You can't decide, and if you're not a person who does media most of the time, and you let something that smells like blood, the journalist is going to get you, and they'll print that instead of what you thought you were going to talk about. So you have to remember, no matter how nice the journalist is, they are not a friend. They have a job, and the most exciting outcome would be to hang you up to dry, probably, in many cases, and to show that this person had cheated, or something. So I start with position of non-trust, and I've had enough hard times there's a couple of things that I have my polite brush off when I discover that the journalist on the other end of the phone I don't have trust. I get rid of them because I can't talk to a person that I don't have trust with. If they're going to misunderstand me on purpose, misunderstand me by accident, or come after me, I'm not going to talk to them. Why would I do that? And we can talk to them about the extent to which scientists do or don't need journalists at all. Most of us hide. And the hide technique is say, I'm sorry, I don't really know much about that topic. Let me give you someone at MIT. And thanks, and you can get off the hook easily. So the trust building, journalist has to elicit trust from the scientist, because I don't have to. It's not in my, unless it's in my advantage to talk to you, I'm not gonna. The things I can't stand is if you already have your story written and you just need a quote from me. I won't. Sorry, no. And I've had very reputable journalists do this to me, and I'm still not forgiving them. Like, I'm sorry, I have to say my own words. Thank you. And you can't say that because it makes the journalist upset. You just say, well, I don't really know. Thank you so much. Or the other one, which is a long-winded thing, to say, well, causation in the case of X and Q and, blah, 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 and they can't quote that. So there's a way to get if you don't have trust, you can not build a story. But I usually, so they have to have the journalist has to have some openness to actually learn what the actual science I'm actually doing is. That's the only place that there is an upside for me.
So it sounds like and maybe this is unique to climate science or other sort of politicized research.
No, anything. Edward's aquifer too,
Yeah, well, water. Well, I'm just curious if, one thing that I often tell scientists that I work with, or I will be glad to help them with, is when you're contacted by a journalist that you don't know, to not immediately say, yeah, sure, I'll talk to you right now, but to actually take a little time and research who they are and what their perspective. Go online and read some of the things they've written in the past, and sometimes you get a sense for that, like, oh, this person is really, they have a very specific perspective, a very, I don't know if you do that much. Do you?
I do. I took that advice too.
Okay. So even if you kind of vet the reporter,
I always say, when's your deadline? And then I say, let me get back to you. I'll set a time about 2. And then I have time to go call someone. I can call somebody at UT and ask journalists about this person, read something about them. Also prepare my thoughts. Also get some information together. Sometimes I say, I'll get back at 2. What kind of story are you looking for? And if they could tell me a little, maybe they'll give me a couple of questions that I can actually get some facts, figures, and be a useful source to them. If they are needing a specific piece of information, I can round it up and get the numbers right in front of me with the, good quality. So preparing for the interview.
Yeah. And do you, so, I'm trying to think how to ask this question. So like when you're going to talk to somebody, maybe it's helpful to just think of like the opposite. So have you had any experiences where things have gone really well and you felt like the journalist did some things that you really appreciate and wish that all journalists would do?
Yeah, a lot of times.
What are some things that made you happy as a scientist?
If they start with a pre-interview, if they are working on a story and its background, it's not due tomorrow. They're just wanting to know, who could I talk to? I'm trying to develop a story. And you could say, this is something that's news. This is something that's happening. You could call so-and-so and get, and I really like those kind of discussions where they're actually trying to find the edge of known science. That's very interesting to me and helpful, and a trust-building exercise, because they may come back and said, we've already pre-agreed that you were going to talk about some specific new finding, and the story is going to be built about a new finding that's important to me, and it may be interlaced with some other people who I know. This is a very good working relationship. When people have a short deadline, I appreciate frankness to say, but I need to talk to somebody who will say, and then sometimes I can say, yeah, you can quote me saying that. You just need someone from UT saying, UT is very proud of the work we've done for. I could say that, sure.
I know, it's kind of controversial.
Check. but people often need a quote, and maybe it's a quote that they already know. If they're frank and say, what I need is a one-line quote from you, affirming something. Say, then we could have a nice, short, successful discussion.
But it sounds like you really appreciate when somebody comes in and they're open to having an exploratory conversation and listening, and not coming in with too
I hate it if people
focused
either say,
perspective.
I have to be an environmentalist or a oil person. Say, yeah, which camp are you in? Well, I drove a car that still uses gas. But I really do care about the environment. Which side do I have to be on? I
It's a
hate
good bumper sticker. Don't make me choose. Well, I want to give Julie a chance to jump in. Just maybe doing the other side of this couples therapy, talking about, or if you want
I just had a question for Sue.
Yeah.
Do you like it when a journalist says, are there other people you suggest I talk to?
Sure.
You do like that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Because I felt like I've asked that question to people I've interviewed before, and they felt like it's not their job to give me other sources.
So that's why it's nice to have a pre-interview a little bit and say if you can suggest some other people, and then you have time to say, I'm talking to these guys, it seems like I vetted them, he seems pretty reputable, can I give him your name?
Yeah.
And then the path is paved. If there's a chance to do a little pre-interview discussion, even on a short deadline, it's useful. If you want some more sources and more people to interview, say right up front, can you give me some other names? And then the person being interviewed can say, no, I don't really have anybody, or I'm not at my computer.
Yeah.
Something. But.
Yeah. So I've done stories across the board where they're sort of in this controversial area, and then in areas where people haven't, I don't think, ever called that scientist about their work before. Like when for my book, I was working on a story about the jellyfish stinging cell, and I don't think no journalist had ever called them before to say, tell me about your work. So
So were they excited or nervous?
Just kind of happy to talk about their work, I mean, it turned out that work was super interesting because, well, this is a little sidestep, but the jellyfish stinging cell is controlled. The trigger is these hair cells that are just like cells in our cochlea and they were working on repairing well, he was working on sea anemones actually, but they release these repair proteins that we don't make. And so there was this potential for using those repair proteins to repair cochlea, which if you hear a loud noise and it blasts apart your hair cells, you go deaf. So there was this really interesting news side to the story, but so he was very happy to talk about it. I've been working on a story lately.
You're an awfully good interviewer also.
Well,
I'm happy to talk to you too.
Well, thank you. But I've been working on a story lately about CFCs. And it turns out the CFC community is really hard to talk to. They don't want to talk to anyone. They're very closed. They're very nervous because CFCs are huge greenhouse gas problems. The Montreal Protocol is held up as this icon of the world working together to solve a greenhouse gas problem. It turns out there's some leaks in it, and that's what my story is about, and they don't want to talk about it. So how do you deal with this? So on the one hand, I think building trust with someone who has hardly been interviewed at all is fairly easy because you just show up and you say, I've read your papers, they're really cool, will you talk to me? And generally they are happy to. The CFC people, and I have had issues with this with jellyfish scientists also, but which is a story in the book, but I think it's kind of what Sue says. It's paving your path in with them, not being in a huge rush. If you can, not be in a huge rush. And that requires, so I'm a freelancer. So I can have some negotiations with an editor where I can say, okay, they'll usually say to me, what do you want your deadline to be? And I'll usually estimate how long I think I need. And so that gives me a few weeks to talk to people. And if you are in a situation where you can build yourself a few weeks, then do that because it allows you to read the papers, develop questions, talk to your source, go back to your source again if you have to. And my CFC article isn't due till January, so I have lots of time. And I think that, it's hard because if you're a freelancer and you're trying to get out an article a week or something to make a living, you may not have that luxury. This job is a hard job, but if you can do something to give yourself some income that's more stable, and then do your freelance work on a time scale that allows you to build trust with your sources. That's sort of the best you can do. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's what I try to do. I try to keep kind of a background level of income from doing things like working with Sue or some textbook stuff, and then do these freelance jobs that are more kind of, with National Geographic or science or whatever, my bigger stories, but I don't do that many of them.
Let me push you just a little further. So I work a lot with scientists, and I'm always trying to convince them to talk to reporters. And
So what percent do you get rejection?
What percent reject that? I don't know. It's a good question. Well, often I'm trying to help them promote a specific piece of research that they're excited about. So it's often not that hard. But you'd be surprised. There's probably, I don't know, a quarter of them or so say, oh, no, I like this work, but I don't really want to talk to reporters. A lot of them, what I was going to say actually is, a lot of them tell me, they say, well, no, there's no point in talking to reporters because they're just going to get it wrong. And I don't want to go through that. I don't want to be misquoted. And so I was going to ask you, Julie, how are there things that scientists can do that if they will place a little trust in the reporter, that can help ensure that you do get the right story and that you do tell it well? Because that is a significant concern that I hear from scientists that I think Sue even touched on just a little bit. And so beyond just the scientists not talking to the reporters, what's a middle way? What are some things they can do?
Yeah, I mean, I think if a scientist builds trust with the reporter too, like that can help, right? So if the reporter understands the scientist's story, then they do a better job of reporting it. I mean, it goes both ways, right? And then there's this problem, though.
Sometimes it just needs to. Sometimes the story is only this long, and all that there's room for is you got 16 words. What are they?
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
And there's not a lot of choice. It's already got the sentence written. So can you get 16 words that go in the sentence together?
Yeah.
No, isn't that not true?
Yeah, and there's this other issue, which is that, a lot of sometimes scientists will say, oh, I want to read your article, and of course you can't do that. So then you have a problem. I mean, in the best world, like when you work for like National Geographic has a fact checker who will come back in, and they will take your story back to the source and say, here's your quote, verifying, please verify, or here's a fact, please verify. But, things move so fast now that most places don't fact check any longer. And like News Alert, books are not fact checked. So my book was not fact checked, except for I paid someone to fact check it, and I still found mistakes afterwards. But there's, so this issue of like how journalism is supposed to work, which is the reporter goes in, talks to the scientist, writes the article, a fact checker comes back in, goes back to the scientist, comes back to the journalist and says, okay, you got this fact wrong. A lot of times we short circuit that now. And it's very difficult. I don't know if I have a solution without saying we need more fact checkers. We need to invest in fact checkers.
One of the most helpful things I've ever had is when we're having this discussion. If they send me some questions, and then I type out what I want to say, and then we don't have any argument about the quotes, because I get a chance to be articulate, which I'm not necessarily on the phone, and the answer may or may not be targeted to the question, but there's a good increases the chance. So I really like digital interview. Part of the process is to get a chance to write some prose.
But then the journalist is like, that's really boring. I can't use that, because it's better when you're talking and you make some great analogy, and I'm like, that is really great for my reader, and so that's
sometimes as part.
As part.
Yes. Yeah. I what you said. But it's nice to get a chance to provide some of the content correctly with the right significant figures and so forth.
Right.
Right. So,
Great. Well, I mean, I have tons of questions, but I can sense out there people probably wanting to ask their own questions, and so I think to keep things kind of lively, does anyone feel free to you can tack on to some of the things we're talking about already, or if you have a different direction you would like to. Oh yeah, can we pass we can pass a mic? Not that we really need it to hear each other, but because we are actually video. Yeah, we are recording this, and so just having good audio is good.
Is it working?
Okay.
There we
No,
go.
it is.
On this question of getting quotes right from the scientist, I do a little bit of different kind of writing than Julie does, and that I have the opportunity to get the scientist to approve the quote that I say. And I find it's been a really good relationship. What's the reticence for going to the scientist and say, this is what I say you said. Did I get it right?
You can do that as a journalist, but what you can't do is give them your whole article.
Well, you can't give them the whole article?
No.
And why is that? Because
of journalistic integrity, because the journalist is supposed to be an independent reporter. Now, Mark couldn't give the whole article to Sue because he's working in a public relations situation.
Yeah, most of my writing is that way. Where I'm writing for the. Okay.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? So everyone is taught in journalism school that they're supposed to not send their material back, but it makes it hard. Especially, Julie mentioned earlier that a lot of staff, media outlets, they no longer have the fact checkers that normally would have been in place to keep you from making mistakes. And as a writer, I really appreciate having somebody who's going to be my safety net, because I make mistakes all the time, and no matter how many hours I've spent reading the papers and talking to the scientists and thinking about it and writing and polishing it, mistakes happen. I mean, you misunderstand which protein is the one that sticks onto this thing, and it's a little scary to me. But the standards in journalism haven't shifted to it, taking that into account. So maybe that'll change in the future. I don't know.
I get a lot of people doing what you said, even from outside, from PBS. They want to put a voiceover. They want to shorten up something that I said, and it was 2 paragraphs long, and they want to say, and they say, "Is this correct? Is this correct?" And send it. And it's their fact checker calling and saying, "We've shortened up this. Is it correct?" As it.
all the time, and I tell people ahead of time, I'm going to take what you said here, and I'm going to make it here.
That's what journalists.
Because this isn't exactly what you said.
That's right.
This is what I say you said.
Yeah, you can definitely get a quote approved as a journalist. You just can't give them your whole article. Go ahead and.
Depends on the outlet. So I've written for, if it's NASA sponsored, they let the scientists review the whole article.
Okay.
It's basically a combination of 3 really hard fields. So you're probably going to get lots of things wrong. Also, a local Bay Nature magazine, and the editor was a journalism professor at Berkeley, and he always sent out the whole article to
Really?
scientists. So maybe I shouldn't be admitting
no,
that on the record. That goes to NSAW, so delete this part.
No, I think that's fine. I mean, I guess, some places may feel like that's the best way to go, but yeah.
So I'm curious as to what, if you're trying to make a story interesting, what target audience are you guys usually trying to go to, and how do you decide what target audience? If you are trying to say, well, this needs to be changed, or if you have some kind of message, how do you get it to the right audience that you're interested in?
It's such a good question. And I think if you write without your audience in mind, you may not. I think if you write with your audience in mind, you always write a better story. So you have to make up your audience in your mind depending on what the story is. And it may, it's going to be different. Like if I'm working with Sue, then the audience is going to be a more technical audience. If I'm writing for my book, I was thinking of oftentimes like my sister, who had never read any. Yeah, my sister, who has never read any science before, but who's a bright, really bright person. And I thought if I made it interesting enough, she would read it. So I heard one person say the audience they write for is me before I knew this. So that's like a good audience. But I think that if you have an actual audience in your head of who you want to write for, it really helps you write. Mark, I don't know. Do you have?
Yes, I think that's a good point. For me, I generally am writing for a very broad audience. So I'm assuming that whatever I write, it's on the web, it's on a podcast, it's in a magazine. It's, I'm not, if I'm writing about astronomy, I'm not writing to other astronomers. In fact, I try to think of the opposite. I try to think of, okay, I've just interviewed an astronomer. I'm going to write this so that somebody in neuroscience is going to find this interesting. So I'm usually imagining an intelligent person, a well-educated person, but somebody who doesn't know anything about the topic at hand. And I sometimes get frustrated in talking to scientists because they say, oh, I don't want you to dumb down my science. They use this phrase, dumb down. And I always think of this famous quote. It's basically, we're all ignorant. We're just ignorant about different things. And that's true, right? No matter what you're an expert in, even Sue, right, expert in climate science, if I asked you something out of your area of expertise, you would be just as lost as the rest of us, right? So I always assume that I have a well-educated audience, but they don't know anything about this topic, and that usually works pretty well.
I think the issue about dumbing down. The answer to that is we want to talk to people outside your specialty. I mean, most of us, I don't do climate science. I do one type of thing. I do one tiny piece. And that's true for all scientists. They do tiny piece. So you want to make it accessible to other people who are not at your the sessions at which technical meeting which you're presenting at. Everyone else won't understand this unless I dumb it down. Everyone else won't understand it. And don't we know that, scientists? Anyway.
I wanted to talk about another person in this relationship who hasn't been mentioned yet, and that's the editor. I know a lot of times when I'm writing something, I spend a long time with the scientists, and I work very hard to get everything right, and all the things that Sue wants in there, this is true if X and Y and Z, and I put all that in there, and then it gets to the editor, and the editor just crosses that part out and leaves in this is true. And I have to fight back, but sometimes you can't. Sometimes the editor just says, well, it's too long or it's too complicated. People aren't going to understand this. So I think it would be great for Julie to talk about her experiences with that, but also, I think it's just something that scientists need to know about, that it's not always the writer's fault. We're not always the last word on what the story ends up being.
Yeah, that's for sure true. And one thing that really is, the titles, the headlines of articles are not, the writer does not write them. The editor writes them. And so a lot of times a scientist will be like, that headline was horrible. And I'm like, I know, you're right, it was horrible. Because
clickbait.
Because it's clickbait. And so there is this tension between the writer and the editor that can truly be mystifying and difficult. Especially as a freelancer, I'll think I have a great story and I can't sell it. Like an editor won't buy it. And I'm like, how could you not buy this? This is so good. And you get rejected and rejected and rejected until you eventually, I'll give up. So, yeah. And then in terms of the actual editorial process, it can be brutal. I remember working on a story, again, this was for National Geographic. It was about, there was this group trying to bring back the aurochs. Do you know what those are? They're like an extinct bovine, and they're trying to backbreed these ancient breeds of cattle to get more aurochs genes in them. And, I talked to all these scientists and all these breeders, and I wrote this story, and it came back from the editor like a Jurassic Park movie. It was just completely made into this sensational, sort of unserious piece. And I felt horrified by it, but that's how it ran. So Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an issue. And yeah, I don't think scientists do know maybe how the editorial process can
I
be
do.
destructive
It's
to.
in all those novels and TV shows and so forth. I was on the high school yearbook. I know. But I think that's one reason I think you have to almost build a piece of the science, not just the fact, but a piece of the science, a piece of the exploration into the story.
That's a good point. I mean, if you.
So the editor he can take it out, but it has a more drastic editing job. If you say
That's right.
this scientist has been working on some things involving instruments and tools and grad students, cute little picture of or personal story, to understand this, and they think the important outcome is such, then that part about the quality is kind of covered because it's part of a story that's got a discovery in it.
And there is this thing about knowing your editor too, and then the care and feeding of your editor. So if you have an editor who is going to cross some stuff out, you might want to put some stuff in for them to cross out. That's one thing you can do. Put in a line that you're happy if it stays in or you're okay if it comes out. You can do that. I mean, if you have and that's if you have an editor who is bossy and needs to have their fingers in it. But, if you're lucky and you work with an editor who just makes your work better, then that's a dream. Yeah, that's a dream. And then you feel like, oh, that's right. This para should have been here. And you're right. It works so much better. So, I mean, the editorial relationship is something you also have to negotiate.
Scientists do this too, because we have peer review. So it's the same thing. It's why same thing. People, you get two peer reviewers, they take out alternate sentences, and you're like, so. They do it separately, each one has it and they cross out every other sentence, so then you end up with. But and peer review, you don't have to take it. They do have to sign off on it somehow, so you have to negotiate. Maybe not quite as autocratic as editors.
Oh, editors can be pretty autocratic.
Peer review is probably not as autocratic as extremes, but
yes. Yeah, it's interesting. I just was thinking back to being an early writer. It's the first year or two that I was writing, and I used to resent having to be edited, right? Because everything I wrote was perfect. But it was really neat when that dawned on me, I don't know, 2 or 3 years in, like you said, how much better your writing can be with a good editor. And so I really came to appreciate that. And they catch facts that you might have gotten wrong, and or some kind of bias that you might have let creep in that you... because you're writing for yourself, you don't catch it. So anyway, I'll just add another little nod to the editors. It's good to have a good relationship.
Yeah. So this is a follow-up to the earlier question about scientists being coded and miscoded. I think it is very important for scientists themselves to communicate their ideas in such a way that there is very little space for being miscoded. I've been so far interviewed thrice in the last 3 years, approximately once a year. And the first time was a disaster. And the second, because there's a little bit of miscoding, but the second time I learned fast, I suppose. So I had to make sure that I said exactly the things that I wanted to be conveyed. So that way, that is why I think it is extremely important for scientists to learn communication skills. It's not enough that we present to an audience with bars and diagrams and graphs. We should also be able to communicate science to the layperson who is not well versed with science in such a way that they understand science without dumbing down the science.
I'm really glad you said that. I was hoping that would emerge from our conversation. That's what we tell our scientists we work with all the time. If you only got 3 points that you could make,
make 2 of them.
Well, if you can only make
the
2,
journals will hang up on you.
But it's you're like, well, I'm going to spend a half hour talking to the reporters. I'm going to be able to say all the things that are important. But if you say everything that's important, then they don't know what is important. And so, to have those 2 or 3 or however many main points that you just keep coming back to, that you make sure they, if that's all they got, you want to be able to write those out and be able to say those.
I also write them out and decided that I have 2 points I'm going to make. That's what my instructions take. It says 2 points. And then I write them out 5 or 6 different phrasings. And the journalists seem to mostly like that. That if I say the same thing Scientists hate it, but it seems that it's helpful to say it the same thing 2 or 3 different times with different length and phrasings and formality and buzzwords and not buzzwords, and try saying the same thing, and then they maybe get a usable quote out of it, and they may use it as is, and you stop, let them have a chance to write it down correctly, or say it again and say this is the key quote.
That's actually a really useful thing for a journalist to hear, because you could maybe, if a scientist says something and you're like, oh, I can't quote that, you could say to them, like, can you restate that? And then maybe they won't be annoyed.
I think I've been coached a bunch of times on mostly by video when and they're trying for a sound bite and they're not getting a sound bite, and they just ask you, can you say that all again? Can you say that and take a breath? Can you say that and stop after each sentence? And you get to say it a bunch of times, and then they end up with a usable quote. You're almost making a product, but maybe you are.
Yeah.
I wanted to, going back to the quoting and what you can show the scientists and not, I just wanted to point out that there's a difference between science writing and science journalism. And when you're talking about the Montreal Protocol and CFCs, you definitely don't want those groups of people to see your work because they may be tipped off, and there may be industry involvement. There may, in my case, it's often big pharma. And so it's very important that you follow ethical protocol to not show. Working for NASA, that's different. It's sponsored content, essentially working for a client that has a vested interest in the outcome, versus working independently as a journalist or for a publication. And I know that there's, especially some people who've been journalists for a long time and investigative journalists, they get really grumbly about the blurring of the lines between science writing that's more public relations focused and journalism. So I just want to keep that division in mind too, that often the interviews may go differently, the vetting process may go very differently too, depending. Yeah. Yeah, because I may be interviewing a scientist at a pharmaceutical company, but I am not going to let that person see my article and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Science writing and science journalism are two different things, and so it is. Yeah, I think when I started working on my book, someone said to me, "Think of yourself as a science writer instead of a science journalism," because it was a book, and that gives you leverage to be more creative and narrative. But science journalism is definitely its own thing. And actually, there's a huge debate going on about that at NASW right now, as anyone who's following along the listservs has seen.
Should we elaborate? Some of the scientists may not be aware of that. So NASW is the National Association of Science Writers, and it's traditionally been people who have worked sort of full-time as like staff science journalists. And the makeup of the organization has shifted a lot over the last 20 years or so, right? And so a lot more people have become freelance. A lot of people have supplemented their work with working for industry or other
institutions, academic institutions. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, become public information officers. And so there's historically those people haven't been allowed to be president of the society or vice president.
Officers. Right.
Right. So there's a big debate about whether they should be allowed to be officers. Anyway, that's the short version.
Yeah, because the idea is if they are officers and they are not independent, then it could compromise the whole NASW as a unit, because they could be subject to ethical, not be independent ethically. So there's a big debate going on right now.
I just wanted to add one thing about getting quotations right. I don't think anyone's mentioned this, but I personally, whenever I'm interviewing, I record my conversation and I double check with the scientist ahead of time that it is okay to record. So they are aware that they are on record. That means that I can go back and check the quotes. I can transcribe everything. So it also means I can get the science correct. At least it's whatever they said. Maybe they misspoke. But that creates another little a really nice bumper in there to make sure that everything goes as smoothly as possible. So I would recommend that.
Yeah, I record also. I record you even, don't I?
Yeah.
Yes. And
I find it very difficult because you have to stick to your script. If you're going to be recorded, you you can't trust very much because if you're having a conversation, you can say no, wait, rewind, let me try that again.
You could say that even. You could say that on a
Well, you have
record.
to have trust. You have to have trust and say that because then they have evidence that you said that, but then you decided that it wasn't You're trying to something you've not done before. If it's real news, so you found out something new. It's new to the scientists too. That's what we're all trying to get out, right? And you've not said it a whole lot of times before, so you're trying to get it across, and you're trying to use small English words rather than jargon, and it may not come out right, so you don't really want to be, if you're trying hard to help construct these quotes, you might have to have a couple runs at it. And scientists are not trained to be English majors. Inarticulateness is our middle name.
You can always say something that's off the record, but I don't know if you, Julie, if you want to explain what that means since you've got the microphone.
Yeah, I mean, like, it means that you can't use it, like, as a journalist. I mean, you can't use it in an article. They can tell you some information that then you can go use in another way. You can try to find another source, or you can,
and you can often start this conversation saying, "Can we just do this on background, not on the record, and have a conversation?" And then once we find out what you want the story to be, then you can do a more formal for quotation interview and make the conversation into even two short halves, so that you can ask these questions. You have you build some trust. So.
I think that's a good way to do it. Not everyone may realize that off the record is a very difficult thing to navigate because you can't do it sentence by sentence, right? So you can kind of, if you establish some ground rules before you start the conversation, that's fine. But if you have a conversation and halfway through a person says, "Oh, I wasn't supposed to tell you that. That mean thing I said about one of my collaborators, that's off the record." You can't really do that because once unless you've established that in advance. So anyway, so you should establish the ground rules before you start an interview, basically.
So I have one more question going back. If I can go back to like the target audience. So you said that, Mark, you said that you generally think about well-educated people and writing for people who are going to have a level of understanding and interest in this kind of thing. But one of the really important things, I believe that one of the really important things that is this, and this really difficult thing to bridge, is this gap between the quote-unquote layperson and the scientist and the well-educated person who's interested in this. And how do you guys communicate science and, how do you get it to the person who's going to affect the change the most? Say there's, say there's like, the truck workers who are pouring in fossil fuels, or like getting it to the masses and getting it to people who are also going to be affecting the change.
So you're talking about actually influencing people, not just getting them interested in it, but actually changing their opinion?
Yeah, or even just getting it to the people who aren't, getting them interested and getting them to understand what's really going on. Because I think, whenever I tell people I'm a graduate, I'm working on my PhD in cell and molecular biology, I get, oh, wow, well, that's like, I could never do that. And I think this kind of goes back to how do you kind of start bringing that gap down and bringing that like level of where people have, or how do you change that impression?
It's sort of like an intimidation that people are like, "Oh, that sounds. I don't think I could even understand what you're talking about because it's cells." And is that sort of what you mean?
And I guess just getting it to people, not just the people who were going to read it anyway, but the people who kind of almost need to read it more, need to understand it more.
In my writing, I'm always looking for some kind of hook that's going to hook in the broadest, people. So I try to think of, okay, imagine somebody who is not interested in cellular biology. Maybe they're not, but maybe they're interested in cancer, or maybe they're interested in
metabolism.
Yeah, right. They're interested. Yeah, they want to know how diets work or something.
Yeah.
I always try to find hooks that I think would tap into, basically you want to hook into something that people already think about. They're already concerned about. There's a national conversation going on about whatever it is about, cancer.
I've heard some people do brilliant things by analogies too.
Yeah.
I heard one this morning. I came in early because I was afraid I was going to get stuck with a flood, creeks flooding, and so I listened to a new blog from Catherine Hayhoe, who's from Texas Tech, and so she was talking about why you should use climate models, and she said, well, it's like driving she's talking at Texas Tech, and she's saying it's like driving down that straightaway from Lubbock to someplace, Plainview, and you could drive it looking in your rearview mirror until you get to that place where there's a curve. So that's where you need the model, is to look ahead. Bingo, woman.
Good analogy.
Yeah.
And it's a very local analogy, very accessible to, well, you said truck drivers. It made me think think of that analogy. It's quite brilliant.
Yeah, I think, I think you've hit on a really important issue that's maybe societal and institutional and something that we should all really think hard about. I think hard about that a lot of the time, which is why I wrote a book about jellyfish for, my sister. And I think that, as Mark said, it's our job to somehow come up with that creativity, the insight, the analogies. There's a lot of different platforms we can use now, like podcasts and video, and that can hopefully bring in people who don't pay attention to science, because science is really, it's like how we understand the world, but I think that this is an important problem that we should all sort of struggle with. We probably can't solve here this morning, but that we should recognize as something we should struggle with.
In your book, you use personal story.
Yeah, her personal story.
And so it's very accessible because it's about
my bad boyfriend.
Your bad boyfriend. Okay. Jellyfish, and it's very vivid because you remember the story about. You remember the science stories because they're tied to stories. So.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Okay, let's take 2 more questions, and probably short questions, or short answers rather.
Short answer. We can do that.
Okay, my question is related to what we were just talking about building trust between the scientists and the public, whoever that is. And my understanding is that it's a combination of being seen as competent but also warm, and that scientists are seen as very competent by the public but not warm. They're seen as warm as lawyers. So I guess I'm wondering about your strategies for making scientists seem like people who care and are trustworthy.
I think if you can tell, Sue's going to hate this, but if you can have scientists speak in ways that are interesting, telling a story, have a scientist say something about driving with the rear view mirror, that's something relatable. I think if you can make scientists into people and not sort of this sort of separate species, then or even or the villain in Spider-Man. Yeah, so if there's some way to make, scientists are people but somehow there's a perception that scientists. I personally hate Big Bang Theory for that reason, because I feel like it makes scientists into this kind of strange group that live these strange lives, and scientists are not. Scientists are people. So if there's a way that you can catch a scientist just doing something simple that everybody else does, like drive down the road, you can warm them up. Even if they're thinking really big global thoughts all day, they still have to drive to work, or they still have to eat lunch, or whatever it is. And those are stupid examples, but There's somehow we have to break down this perception.
And we hate
And
that. We hate being made
Scientists
into
hate
humans.
that.
Yes, we hate it.
Being made into
We
humans?
yeah, we hate
What?
it. Yeah, we don't like hedge. It's contrary to our education to intercede, to be personal. We're taught to be impersonal, so we're trying to separate our science from our emotions, and our science from our.
I'm not saying you have
to. It's supposed to be this formal thing that you do steps, and it's separate from the way you got up, what you felt like, whether you had an argument or something. So we're trained, so there's resistance. So we don't even like putting the bios and headshots on our, just like, I have to do that, really? We all hate it, but
you can admit to driving down the road and look in the rearview mirror.
But that's what we have to try to be. You have to try to get the scientists to make these to overcome what you said, to stop sitting in the ivory tower, using it as a cudgel against the rest of the universe, which is, and cut it out because it's not going to communicate very well.
I think there's also a bit of a double standard, right? Like we only come to scientists and ask them technical questions, right? We come to them and say, all right, you're an expert in this, so tell me this really technical thing. But, we don't ask the same questions of artists or sports figures, or, we come and meet them on an accessible everyday plane where we're like, oh, we saw you make that basket. What did it feel like to do this amazing sports thing? For scientists, we don't ask those questions.
The scientists can tell you how they did. The scientists can tell you how they did this, though. The backstory about what. Yeah. Or the scientists can tell you that. How did you find this out? Did you use bottles or did you use? And that's a very interesting question. It makes a scientist into a working human being who doesn't know the answer but found it out through a process of using some tools. And
there's also a question you can ask a scientist, which is, why are you interested in this topic? And they usually have a great answer. When the jellyfish, sometimes it's just because they're beautiful. That's why I started studying jellyfish. You could ask Sue, why do you think flow through rock is interesting? She'd probably give you an answer that might connect with the reader. Just like humans. Not exactly humans.
What drives them, what motivates them, what was the scientific process, and then relate it to all of us so that other people want to read it. And that is a science communicator's job, I think. And try to get it to as many people as possible, whether that's mainstream media or children's publications, or nerd night, or whatever type of thing it is.
I think I mentioned once when we were talking before this, that I have this dream that the world would be a better place if people were having scientific arguments the way that we have political arguments. Politics is something you have to read and understand, and it is. But we seem to be able to do it, have these political arguments. And for some reason, I don't go out at night with my friends and talk science, or my friends who aren't scientists. So I know it, but so I think that there is this sort of siloization of science that I wish was eroded a little bit.
One more question.
Okay.
Yeah.
This was really a response to the person who was talking about getting science out to perhaps not particularly educated or scientifically oriented audiences. And I think the beginning is, sort of starting with which media you're going to go through, going to where people are already reading or listening or whatever. And these may not be the places that, our peers view as most prestigious, but they may be what people are doing. I guess take perhaps a somewhat extreme example. For a while I was writing for Woman's World.
Yeah.
And, Woman's World, it's probably not as prestigious as saying that I had something in National Geographic or whatever, but there were lots of people picking that up, at the grocery store, and it was probably reaching a group that doesn't usually read science and was able to get some process of science and things like that into it.
Yeah, if you can get an editor to pick up a story, it's. Yeah.
How about a quick idea for an article by somebody here? Scientists, cars have flaps too.
And on that note, let's close the panel. Let's give a warm round of applause to our panelists.
Thank you.
So we're going to do about a 10-minute break, restrooms, coffee, drinks, more food, and then we'll reconvene back here at 11:45, which should be in about 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Great. Score. All right. See you guys then.
Okay, so we just came back from lunch and we all broke into 3 groups and discussed issues relating to science communication and found emerging topics that concern all of us repeatedly and broke those into themes and tried to find solutions to make an action plan so we're not running into these issues anymore. So each group will come up and present for 5 minutes, tell us what your group talked about and what answers they came up with, and then the audience will have about 10 minutes to ask questions and we'll see what emerges.
Guess I'm the only one who wants to come up. That's okay. So the first point that we talked about was the problem of conveying the process of science and of uncertainty to children and the general public, and especially people who think that they don't care about science. Should I do solutions to that, or okay? So one example was really thinking about relatable content, something that people can connect to. One example, which was great, was the gross out column in
Scholastic, yeah.
So, which is targeted to kids, and a really gross picture, and then talking about the science principles behind it. Because who doesn't love gross stuff? Using analogies, that was brought up earlier in the panel as well, to connect the point that you're trying to make. Using visuals, graphics, video, all types of visual communication to help convey your ideas. And finally, working with different outlets or pairing and pitching to unexpected outlets to try to get beyond the bubble, to connect with the people who think they aren't interested, go where they already are.
The next one was finding credible sources on deadline who are willing to meaningfully discuss sensitive topics and systemic issues. It sounds like a thesis. So we were just talking about that issue of trying to find a source quickly to speak on deadline, but especially one, not just to comment on like what's your thought on this study, but like why, what are your feelings about this cancer drug costing $100,000? And sources being reluctant to discuss that because it's not their area of research, but you really need that big picture kind of quote. So we talked about some solutions to that being, of course, building relationships with PIOs who you can go to and you know that they can possibly track down somebody like that for you. Going to conferences and getting a feel for the big thought leaders in those fields and who might be willing to speak about those big issues. But also Twitter is a great source to find those sort of like contrarian viewpoints. And then a meta database of sources, because we were throwing out different databases that contain sources that we're aware of. Like there's some in health and there's some general ones, and then there's like women and diverse sources, and like maybe a database of databases, and including the sort of big picture kind of sources who are readily available.
And then our third point was balancing timing issues between a news announcement and an actual story, which is something that I run into working for a university. I have a bunch of researchers. They get in touch with my office when they get a grant, and that's an announcement, but it's not a story to say, we got X dollars from the NSF. That's a headline. There's needs to be more to make that a story. And often that story comes after months or years of work. They don't reach out at months or years later, they come at the beginning. So trying to come in at the right time is tricky sometimes. And also dealing with embargoes throughout that period, or issues of somebody else scooping the research, et cetera, et cetera. So the one thing that came up out of our discussion was perhaps making the story process-based rather than results-focused. Talk about the process that those researchers are going through, which kind of does connect back to our first one of conveying that science itself is the process, not just the results.
I'm going to correct my statement and discussion between because that's more logical. So does anyone have a question? We have some experts up here on science and uncertainty, sources, and timing issues. So I think it's a good, maybe y'all could elaborate on how scientists, when is a good time to reach out to media? What kind of things in the science process are newsworthy? Think about it. Or maybe how much lead time before stories go.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
We're hoping you can.
Yeah, Mark knows.
Yeah. Do we kind of use other mics too?
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you. One of the big struggles we have is that scientists often come to us when they're publishing big research, but they let us know like the day it's publishing. And that's clearly not enough time to put together a promotional campaign. Usually, ideally, we like to have about a month of lead time. We never get it, but if we could have that much time as science communicators or as public information officers, that gives us time to pull together photos, maybe shoot some video, interview 3 or 4 different people in the lab. But yeah, scientists often don't appreciate that it's, just as science takes a long time to do, pulling together a story that you can then turn around and tell the media can take quite a bit of time as well. So as much time as we can get, we take. Anyone else?
On that, Mark, I also work with Council of Science Editors. Might this be a place for better collaboration with journal editors, if there could be a way that, the journal editors could sort of reach out to authors' institutions once they accept something?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. Just to tack onto that, we sometimes the journals will tell us about papers, but they won't tell us until 5 days before it publishes, and that's often a scramble to try and pull something together on that kind of notice.
Months in advance. So.
In my way of thinking, that when the paper is published is a little bit too late anyway, and I realize that if it's an incredibly competitive medical field, perhaps there's an embargo issue. But if it's not that incredibly competitive, that by the time the paper comes out, all the grad students who are the cute ones, have graduated and disappeared. It'd be better if people, to incentivize researchers to when they're in the thick of things. If it's about process, the story could be about process. We haven't finished the study, but we have a couple of really cute grad students who've solved interesting problems that are part of the key parts of the solution. And they're finishing their thesis, and it's real time, it's before the journal article, because the journal always hangs on to it for some period of time anyway, messing with peer review and whatnot. So.
Oftentimes there may be 2 or 3 or even more groups working on different aspects of a certain objective under a certain specific goal, like, for example, NASA's astrobiology initiative. So instead of just covering 1 or 2 papers, it might be a good idea to cover all of them together in a big feature. This will be a very good thing because they will be more than happy to share. And it is also good for them to put on their CV as a collaborative venture, which goes out to the eyes of the public. Because agencies like NASA very much want such things to be put out there.
I'm going to handle this side, so
Yeah, I mean, to add on to that, agencies like NSF, National Science Foundation, really want broader impacts. So whenever you're writing grants as a early career scientist, you have to talk about how you're going to get your research out to the public. So if people can work together on that. I had another point I can't remember now. Any other questions in regards to?
So Emily really wanted me to bring up something regarding embargo and such. I'm not sure how it works in medical and health, but in astronomy, there is a catalog of sorts. It's called a telegram. So when astronomers discover something in the sky, they'll post the coordinates and maybe a sentence or two to try to inspire other astronomers to go look at the same spot. So this has become a big deal with multi-messenger astronomy, when you can see things with different forms of light and also neutrinos and gravitational waves. So last fall, someone posted on there regarding a follow-up observation, and I reached out to that person to try to get more information, and he talked to me on record. The next day, he wrote me and said, off the record, we're submitting to Science, and we want to wait to talk to any press. So then he ghosted me for months because I was trying to get more information. I spoke with an editor who said, that's fine, follow the embargo. Embargo meaning just wait until it publishes in Science, but have an exclusive background story where I am the sole reporter who has been able to communicate with these researchers to really find out the process of the science, what happened, how they came to this discovery. Because what had happened is a particle detected in the South Pole stemmed from a active galaxy billions of light years away, and they also detected gamma ray light and X-ray light and radio waves and optical light. So it was the first neutrino multi-messenger. There was an issue with not understanding embargo for the scientists and not understanding what exclusive story means. And meanwhile, one of the heads of the other project had talked to reporters and scooped them. And in the end, the person I had spoken to never would talk to me except for letting me know it was coming up in Science in 5 days when I'd already received that embargo list from Science. So this is just a misunderstanding of embargoes and when to talk to the press and what an exclusive story is. And how frustrating it can be for many different sides. So in the end, I didn't get to report on this discovery that I was probably the first reporter to actually have seen, which was a really sad thing because I love that stuff. Like, that type of astrophysics is my jam. So it was really sad to not be able to write about it.
And I'm pretty sure embargoes are simpler than neutrinos, too. So.
Okay. Sorry, that was a really long explanation.
Another place that might be good to step in as a journalist is at conferences. People have talked about going to conferences to make connections, and then you're getting the scoop before it's published. But I guess the worry with the scientists is that it needs to be more process-based because it hasn't necessarily been peer-reviewed yet. So go to conferences and make connections with scientists at conferences. My suggestion.
Just completely missed my mind. There are some resources like in biology. There is a pre-publication server called BioRxiv. If you go there, you have tons of biologists. They put up their paper. It's out there for everybody to have access to. It is being peer-reviewed. So you have an idea of what people are going to publish, and then you can decide whether you want to pitch the story or not to them. Am I making sense? Okay.
Yeah, but those stories can change, by the way.
What is that?
Those papers can change. The results.
Well, they change, but not in a. Well, there may be some updation because we have done that too. But it won't. The main story will be the same. It won't be a dramatic change from the original results, from what I have seen.
Do you want to?
No, I don't mean to undermine what you're saying. Yeah, it's a great source, but those papers the results can actually change as they become peer-reviewed. So you have an understanding of something that happened and it didn't really happen, in some cases. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be so negative about this. It's a great source, and there's other there's archive I'm familiar with as well. Yeah, this is bioarchive, but there's a big archive as well, and there are other repositories of these papers as well. One of the problems that I would find with something like that, I'm full of problems, but one of the problems is what's good, what's bad. I mean, there's so much, right?
And I think that's when we were getting into the how to find sources who can talk about systemic issues or problems in your field that you're covering. What's good, what's bad science, what's newsworthy and what's not is a big question too. And it depends on the publication and everything. But I feel like that was one that was important to me, affects me a lot. It's just because sourcing can be, from the scientist's point of view, it can feel like you're just being reached out to fill a void quickly on deadline.
I would say your example question about how much it would cost is a crazy thing to ask somebody who's a researcher.
Well, oncology researcher.
Still, but it's not something.
Patient care.
Was from me. I'll speak up.
So, you got to ask the.
So the example was basically it would be an oncologist researcher at one of the big cancer conferences, say ASCO or something, and the trial results have just been presented, and they said one drug extends progression-free survival by 3 weeks compared to a different drug, but it costs $100,000. And so that was kind of the context, which.
But that's a kind of not a researcher question. That's a societal value question.
Well, but there's risk-benefit scientists who study, medical scientists who study the cost-benefit analysis.
Cost-benefit
person,
not a. Yeah.
But they do medical research too. Yeah. So they're at the same conferences.
Yeah, and the issue kind of in oncology is that oncologists haven't been bringing up for. Financial toxicity is a big issue for patients, and there's kind of a disconnect with, providing the care that they provide, but the patient's going bankrupt. So trying to kind of marry those concepts, which are not really.
And it's a good. I understand why it's a good story. Yeah. It's what people want to know. But people all the time call me and ask me what, I think about climate change and Trump, and I say, listen, I'm not going to talk to you about this. We have to go to a bar. Yeah. We're not. This is not my topic. I can't deal with that in our professional setting. Yeah. Just because you're asking me for a personal, a non-technical, non-research opinion, which would destroy my credibility if I answer that kind of question. That's unless, as you said, maybe they're a specialist in cost-benefit analysis, and it would be.
Or a lot of times, I mean, I think it's not total now, because a lot of times these researchers in oncology are also oncologists who are prescribing these drugs, and so if they're talking with patients about the drugs, they should know how much it costs.
Exactly, and it's like, well, would you give if the patient's in front of you and you have 2 drugs to choose from, are you going to choose the one that might have, and it's progression-free survival, that's a surrogate, so it's kind of all these little, I guess, uncertainty ifs on top of another.
A certain cost.
Right, yeah, and a certain cost. And so
we were trying to brainstorm solutions for that to find, and it is tough because they may feel that it's outside of their wheelhouse, but then yet they're dealing with it every day. They just don't think of it that way. Okay, should we move on to the next group?
Yeah, I was just going to say, let's move on to the next group.
That would be this group. Yeah, this is what Larry. Yes, you want.
I have a question about that. Just one, to some extent, the question is, as you said, societal and hard to answer. So, would you consider writing the article in a way that leaves that question with the reader? You could go without a quote and just saying, look, here's a big question, and it's part of the story right now, this question. So, sometimes if you can't get what you're looking for, maybe you shouldn't look, maybe there's another way to write the article that couches it in a different way that's still really interesting, Okay, yeah.
And Annette,
what you said, that's what I ended up doing.
It is.
Because I didn't
You know, I couldn't find someone who could provide that level of context, and so I just made it very clear up front that the drug really, like, this is all it did.
Yeah.
Clinically.
Yeah, and I mean, that may be just where things are right now, and that may be the most honest way to present the situation. In some cases.
As an editor, I would put 100,000 in the headline too. Yeah, some people are like, no.
No, but it's helpful to hear other people's views.
I actually just was wondering, why can't you ask a researcher about that? Because I was at a conference, this Center for Cancer Prevention Research Institute, CPRIT, of Texas, and there was a researcher, really famous guy, who was developing some of these immunotherapies, and one of the questions that he was asked was, how do you reconcile this with, the chance of a patient surviving with the cost? And it was really interesting to hear his opinion, because it wasn't from a purely financial point of view, and it wasn't like a statistical thing where maybe you couldn't quote anything that said, and this is the actual analysis of it. But his opinion, I think, was really important. And people were asking, why are you doing this if nobody can afford it and nobody can get it? I just was wondering, why wouldn't you be able to ask the researcher?
I think you can ask, they just may not answer.
Yeah. I see what you're saying. Yeah, I see what you're saying.
They make that into your trust.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you're asking me, if you're asking stuff that's outside of my expertise, then the answer is I'm not going to talk to you from my office as myself. We're going to go to a bar and talk to buddies.
Yeah.
And then we can talk about this topic. It's not that I have no opinion. It's just I'm not going to hurt my reputation by having an opinion that I don't, it's outside of my expertise. You called me as an expert based on my resume, and you didn't call me as Joe on the street. I'd be glad we can talk to Joe on the street, but I can't talk as an expert on the topic. It's outside my expertise.
I feel like the journalism happens at the bar.
At the end of the interview, and then if they open up, fine. If not, it's not cutting things off.
Yeah, I sometimes get some of the best information after I've packed up, put away my tape recorder and packed up my bag, and I'm on my way out the door, and they say, oh, I forgot to tell you about this.
That's one of my favorite end fishes. What have you forgot to tell me?
Yes.
What did I forget to ask you?
Right.
That's a wrap-up question, my favorite wrap-up question.
Good one.
Yeah.
I use that too.
Like remember a class.
All right. So our group focused a little bit. I think a lot of these topics that we're talking about are related in many different ways. And so our topic was kind of, how do you make a story out of these things? How do you find a story? How do you find narrative in a story? And how do you make it readable and relatable? And so one of the things that we talked about was asking the source how they got interested in the topic. How did they, why are they doing what they're doing in the first place? And then another thing that we talked about was that scientists tend to be very, they say, okay, well, this was our question, then we did this, and 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 then this was the result. And you look at them and you say, it worked out like that for you? And so getting them, because that can be really difficult to relate to, as a reader. So getting them to say something about what was challenging about their work, or maybe what went wrong, or was there anywhere that you had to change your hypothesis or modify what you were doing. And another way to kind of relate it is if someone's really not if the scientist really is not interested in giving you background information or anything that's not related to the actual results, you can kind of switch it around and make what they're studying the actual subject. So I think Liz made the analogy, there was a group of astronomers studying a black cloud, and black hole, and there was a cloud that was going to go by the black hole, and they thought there was going to be all this crazy awesome research that was going to come out of it and really interesting answers, and in the end it didn't really pan out. Nothing really happened. I guess it just passed by. I don't know. And so instead you could say use that cloud as it's moving along in space as kind of the object to kind of get people interested about it. And then find people who are really interested and invested and excited about the research that they're doing. I had kind of made the point where oftentimes professors are sort of removed from their research. You know, they're not the ones getting their hands dirty, doing the nitty-gritty and getting the results. I know that when I do my research, I package it up so that he can so that I can give him a digest of what's going on. And so, but when I explain what I do, I get really excited about it because it's what I'm doing with my life right now. And so finding someone said that they like to use postdocs as resources because they're not, jaded like grad students, but they know what they're doing and they're still connected with the research. So yeah, again, another kind of way of doing that. And then, and then the other one, okay. The other thing we went into a little bit more was how to approach the actual topic itself. So scientists, again, like I said, will say, well, we thought this, and then we did this, 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 and then this was the result. But that's not how you write in a story. You put the punchline first, and then you go into maybe a little bit later how the process actually happened. So getting a scientist to think more broadly at the beginning about the impact and whatever, and then I think Mark was saying kind of circling around and then getting to the more nitty-gritty and the details and the methods a little bit later is going to help to make the story into a readable piece of work. And something that I thought was interesting that I had never thought about was, because I said, well, why don't you just go look at the abstracts of what the people are doing for a summary? Why don't you go to their grant applications and look at like the broader impact part? But again, the way that that all of these are written are very much in like the scientific method way, hypothesis, test, refine hypothesis, test, and then you get your results. And so if you kind of have to invert the abstract and say what the results were at the beginning and then go into how they got there. And then one more thing is just to kind of probe the actual process itself and figure out, because sometimes you'll get, I guess, like hour-long explanations from scientists, and then they never really actually explain what they do. But understanding the process behind it and then getting them to think in that logical kind of, how do we do this, how do we approach this, and why do we do it that way, can also make it a little bit easier to understand. We have more over here, but that was more, I think, just things that we weren't really focusing on. Did I misquote anybody? Yeah.
I have a question. So I think it's really hard to tell a scientist how to tell a good story, and sometimes it's really hard to probe that out in an interview. So the interviews can take a lot longer because of that, but it's fun as writers if you have the time to know all the other details. So maybe what's a good way to structure the interview to make that narrative story and kind of pull it out of them?
I've never interviewed a scientist, but maybe Mark, you had a really good sort of circular kind of analogy there.
Sure.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of raised that point, right, that scientists are not always the best at being able to make their stories concise and give you the right level of detail and that sort of thing. And so I was, just talking about how I used to make the mistake early on of like trying to go sequentially through their paper and go like, okay, paragraph 1, tell me about this, you use the mass spectrometer to do this. Okay, so what did you do to the sample to like make sure it wasn't contaminated? Okay, let's go to paragraph 2, it kind of working which is what scientists are used to, right? They're used to kind of going in that kind of deductive reasoning kind of way. And eventually I realized that I was, I'd end up with interviews that were, they were too detailed. It was, sort of satisfied my need to fully understand every nook and cranny, but in the end, I wasn't getting what I needed, because really what I needed was the high level, what motivated the work, what were the really big obstacles that had to be overcome, what were the, why should the average person care, all sort of like the big questions. So that's where the kind of spiral thing came from. I was just talking about how, like now when I interview people, I try not to get into the details at all. I don't want to ask them like, so how did you do the third step of this, reaction? I try to save that for the end, and make sure right up front I get all of the really big picture stuff. Anyway.
Yeah, I was going to call out you, Julie, because she has a good interview question that I started.
Well, I
to
was
use.
just going to say the same thing Mark said, though. I like to wait and ask the detailed questions at the end, especially if I'm trying to really understand the process. I did a story a couple months ago about researchers who were putting these electrodes in monkey brains, and then they were sending signals, and the monkeys would do different activities. And he kept saying, the monkeys are doing activities. And I finally said, I don't understand. What are these activities? And he said, well, if we give them this signal, they turn a knob. And if we give them this signal, they push a button. And, they flip a switch. And then it was all really apparent, and that made it in my story. If I had asked him to go through every single step, by the time we got to that point, I would have been lost, and I would have stopped asking him to elaborate, and I would have missed that. So I think it is really important to get the big picture first, and the thing I always start with is, especially if I'm writing about one particular study, what is new about this study, and how does it fit into what people already knew? Because especially if it's a topic that I don't know a lot about, I can get like a 10-minute history, and then I can go back later and look at earlier papers and figure out what I need to fill in my own knowledge. But I think sometimes those little details can help you tell the story. It's just figuring out which one you're going to use, which is a lot of trial and error.
Don't you have to start with easy questions to build trust? I mean, pretty much you have to get on the same wavelength, ask easy questions before you ask really big questions. That's a good question about what's new. What's new in this? Because the researchers, it's an easy question. Researchers used to justifying. I found out something new. That's an easy question. You want to ask a couple of other easy questions to get off the ground before you expect to get actual, things that are a little different.
Another version of that one of my colleagues told me he always asks is, why did you decide to publish this now? Mm-hmm. Because that's sort of opening up, well, it's kind of a different way of asking the same thing.
And those are very easy questions because they're asking what you did on your summer vacation for a researcher. Those are the basic warm-up questions that are easy to answer because they're on top of researchers' minds. So, and then you can delve into things that are on your reader's mind that are a little harder for the researcher after you got a little trust going.
I was going to ask you another question, Sue, because you're on the hot seat, because we need more scientists in this room, what's your favorite, one of your favorite interview questions that you've been asked?
I really like it if people ask me what it is what I wanted to tell them. You know, I have a couple things written on my paper, right? Being me. I have a couple things written on my paper. I'm not sure that's generally true of all scientists because most people don't have my cheat sheet. I always have 2 things written on my paper with several versions of each one. And I really appreciate it if the interviewer is quite open to hearing what I want, what I want to convey.
So,
like,
I guess just starting out
if
the
you were writing
interview
a story, what would you like to see published?
Yeah.
And what facts do you want the people, my readers, to hear about? That's my favorite.
I started doing that, and it makes the writing process easier because someone gave you the story.
That may be like arcane, boring, horrible facts that no one else, that your reader doesn't want to hear about. But
it's one of the first questions I ask. Well, what would you like for people to? That's one of the first questions I ask is when somebody finishes this article, what would you like them to walk away knowing that they didn't know before?
I'm not sure anybody's ever asked me. Great. Yes, great answer. Okay. To me, those are great questions because they're on the easy for the researcher. Mm-hmm. And then if you want to get into things that the reader is really wants to know, how does it relate to the reader's life? Well, scientist hasn't been thinking about the reader very much. You are journalists, the science writers, about thinking about conveying to the reader, and so you guys can work on it together. So my reader is really interested in this kind of stuff, though. What keep having, and so this matter of 3 weeks and high costs. Say my reader's going to be really interested in this. Can you talk to me about that? And maybe you're right. Maybe if you're working on the problem of conveying to a reader all together, maybe it's more easy for the researcher to say something useful.
One of my other go-to questions is, were you surprised by anything in this research? And usually that works, but I had an interview recently where it was a postdoc, and it was a discovery for a function of a protein that hadn't been known before, and this guy just could not make it relatable or understandable in any way. And so I had been talking to him forever, and I was just hitting a brick wall, and I said, so that was my last question, like, what surprised you or excited you about this research? And he said, well, we didn't know the protein did XYZ, and now we do. And at that point, I just gave up.
We should probably
Yeah.
this group.
Yeah, we're right on time. Okay, Richard, you ready?
So we need to post. Yeah. There's
No, we don't need that. We don't need it. You can't read it anyway. I mean, who can read any of this? Tell me what.
We studied over lunch.
Yeah. Well, your eyes are better than mine. I just summarized a little bit. Apologies to my teammates here. Well, I just wanted to focus on a couple of questions. We talked about a lot of different things, but one of them was, how do you get scientists to open up about their work? Several things came out. Came out that some institutions encourage their scientists to talk to journalists, which is a big help. So that's kind of pushing them out the door. NASA's one. And I remember I interviewed Bernard Harris one time, an astronaut who was one of the first to walk in space and do a certain length of time or something like that in space. And he was wonderful to interview. And he said, when I was a boy, I always wanted to be Superman. And he says, last year I flew faster than a speeding bullet, and I lifted a 2,000-pound satellite with one hand. That was pretty cool. So that's easy when the institution is kind of pushing them out the door. It's a lot harder when they don't really want to talk to you. You can pull information out if you do your homework and you know something about what the scientist is doing ahead of time. Never ever go into an interview cold. I think that's just asking for disaster. A friend of mine who does the same type of writing I do was asked to write something for Total, the French oil company. They brought her to Paris. She shows up and she says, "Okay, essentially, what do you want me to write about?" And she had no idea about the project that she had been sent there to write about, whereas she should have done a lot of homework on it, and they almost sent her home without doing the work. So it's really dangerous to go in not knowing, I think, ahead of time what your interview is going to be about. Susan mentioned that, and I think this was a really good point, to ask the scientists about the process that they went through. If I hope I'm getting it right, correct me if I'm not. The process that they went through to get to the point, to get to what you're interviewing them about, to the point of the story. We talked about when you have a difficult subject to explain, we talked about using metaphors. Emily had one wonderful one about, she was writing about insects who find the spot to lay their eggs, and correct me if I'm wrong, with infrared sensors that find burned logs and things in a forest, and that's where they lay their eggs because it protects them from predators. And it turns out that the infrared sensor was under the leg of the insect, and Emily used the term armpit, infrared armpits. I thought that was wonderful. Yeah, really good. I had an instance where I was writing about nanotechnology, and every nanotechnology article I ever read starts off with something like a nanometer is 1/1000th the width of a human hair. Who can relate to that? So I asked the scientist, if a nanometer was as wide as the button on my shirt, how long would 1 meter be? And he said, about as far as San Francisco to Paris, France would be 1 meter. And I thought that was for me, it made it easier to get a picture of what a nanometer was. I thought of a couple of other things after we broke up. And one thing I like to do is I like to play devil's advocate. If a scientist is all telling me about what they're doing, I'll say something like to the effect of, "Who cares?" or "So what?" And oftentimes it goads them into, they get all twitchy and they get excited about it. And that's what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to get to the point where a scientist is excited, eager to tell me what he or she is doing. And I know that when I get to that point, my story's halfway written. So, those were some suggestions. The second thing we talked about was how to deal with misinformation. You get a scientist who's a group that's spent years developing something, and the research comes out, and then somebody with a Facebook following of a few thousand people post something negative about that, and that's out there too. And a good example is the issue of vaccinations. I know some people who won't vaccinate their children, won't have their children vaccinated because somebody said it causes autism. And there's no research to back that up. There's a lot of research to back up that vaccinations prevent some pretty terrible diseases. But it turns out there are other people are dealing with that. Facebook has a bot that Emily might be able to elaborate more on that, but that analyzes these kinds of things, and they have teams of people who are ready to take down the false information once it's identified. And there's another website I'm eager to Google. It's Massive Science, and apparently there's an algorithm that monitors these alternative facts.
There's often, so there was a big conference, I forgot, one of y'all probably know about it, where they did a meta study of how you can increase media's trust and scientists with the public. And one of the outcomes, they basically said if we could contact the experts directly, or they could be commenting and monitoring these articles, that would really help us believe news articles. So what Massive Science did is you can actually chat the author. So once you publish, it sends them an email, so you can ask them a question about the science, and then so they're kind of implementing some tech trust. That's really exciting.
Mm-hmm. Another thing we talked about was, but when you're working on a story, or even before you do your interviews, kind of do some homework to identify the negative side of the story. I write a lot about the oil business, and my clients are often eager to tell how swell they are, how great it is that we're going into Chad to develop this 1,000-mile pipeline that goes across Cameroon and gets heavy oil from Chad all the way to the coast. And it's really good stuff, and it brings millions of dollars and a few high-paying jobs to the country. But if you research it some, there's a lot of negative things that happen. Countries can lose other parts of their economy because all of a sudden you've got a lot of oil money coming in, and so people quit growing agricultural crops, and inflation goes up, and just a whole host of bad things. If ExxonMobil is building a new platform and they want me to tell people how swell it is in the Gulf of Mexico, I might find out from the Sierra Club what they think about it. And it's good to get a different perspective, is all I'm saying. Just have another perspective. So it helps guide your questions, and it also keeps you from stepping in it by saying, this is a great project, and you didn't know that it also managed to kill 12 whales in the process of putting this deep water platform in, or something like that. In other words, it helps to know the background besides what your interviewers, what your scientists and engineers are going to tell you about the project.
And you had said, then you can circle back and cross-check what the naysayers were saying back again with the oil company. So maybe those 12 whales were actually killed by some nearby.
Exactly. You can preempt. You can discuss an issue that's going to come up. Go ahead and discuss it in your article, and then that minimizes the negative ones. So those are two of the things we talked about.
The story that's closest to the, I guess, moves toward correct answer, So the guy's looking at the elephant. You have to get it.
Right. Those are just two of the things we talked about. My apologies to my teammates. I couldn't grasp everything we talked about. So, any questions?
We don't have much time for questions, so any dying questions?
Yeah, we've got time for maybe one or two.
Y'all are just full with science communication.
Apparently I did such a good job explaining it that nobody has any questions. That's okay.
Okay, so they're setting up the gallery walk. So the gallery walk is basically, do you want to explain it, Julie? Because you